Good? Sweet. Okay, so you guys are doing part 1 at the moment, or part 2 or 2, where you're going through and following the scaffold that is on page 8 of your workbook for each of those 3 phases. Okay, so I've got the red dot, arrows, and that's the order that you should do things in, alright? Because that's the one that's going to keep you, minimise the chance of getting confused. Alright, so you go through those 3 phases. Then you're going into part 2 or part 2, and you are going to be doing the prep phase biomechanics, the execution phase biomechanics, and the follow through phase biomechanics for the error that you've found and talked about in each of those 3 phases in part 1. Don't bring in new biomechanics because it needs to be what we call coherent. So coherent means there's a flow, right? The reader, i.e. me, should be able to go, I see what they've done there, and if I start going, what, where's that come from? That's not coherent, okay? And you are going to use the scaffolds on page 10 to 11 of your workbook. And there's something in there that's really important. The standard is quite explicit. It asks you to talk about feedback or feed forward to, in this case it's yourself, all right, about how you would improve the skill. But you've got to do that biomechanically. So what you'll do is go to that exemplar that I'll put online, because I've followed that scaffold on page 10 11 and pretty much used the sentence starters and given you an idea what that might look like. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. So for achieved, if you do part 1 and part 2, Corey, pick up your computer and come and sit here, please. For part 1 and 2, if you do that well, then you'll get an achieved. For merit, if you do part 1 and part 2 well, plus you show interrelationships between the biomechanical principles, that will be merit. Obviously, if you do that well. So, for example, a lot of you didn't flex your knees enough in the preparation phase of the jump shot. So that's going to lead to biomechanical issues with force summation. Because you then can't generate as much force, you can't put as much force on the ball. What of Newton's 3 laws come into play then? 2, alright? So Newton's second law states that if I want the ball to travel far, I have to apply more force, or as much force as possible. There's an interrelationship. Force summation, Newton's second law. Right? So that's what it means by interrelationship. If you can show me 3 connections, it's even better, okay? So think that feedback and feed forward, but you're explaining it in terms of biomechanics, okay? It'll be something like this. If I was to give some feed forward or feedback to myself or to the player, it would be to make sure that they need to get more knee flexion in the prep phase. That's because biomechanically they need to use their larger muscle groups, their smaller muscle groups, in a timed and sequence way, but making sure they use the full range of motion of the involved joints. If they don't do that, they generate less force, which means there's less force applied to the ball. And Newton's second law states that blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you sort of get in the feel of that?
Yeah.
There.
Is that alright if there's like a little bit of repetition, because we've identified the error and we've talked about why it's an error, and you'd say because there's not enough knee flexion, it leads to all of this, and then we make the recommendation. Is that alright if it's almost a little bit repetitive?
It's fine, it's fine. And remembering that when you hand me in the assignment, the essay is going to have the prep phase, although you're doing it in this order, you're going to have prep phase part 1, and then straight underneath it you're going to have part 2, right? So you're going to edit it that way. Although you're not doing it in that order, you're going to do it that way. Does that make sense? All right, so I'll be able to see the flow. All right? Okay, so that's for achieve the merit. For excellence is part 3 or 2. Okay, so that's your conclusion. What you have to do is show me some thinking around what do you think is the part of the skill that has the greatest impact on performance, and what biomechanical principles have the greatest influence. And you can combine these 2 to explain it. So for example, was it the knee flexion in the prep phase? Was it the angle of release of the ball in the execution phase? Or was it a combination of all of them, so you can't really separate them because they all have a flow on? So you need to be giving me that type of information. Question and challenge the worth of biomechanical analysis. I'm not going to go into it too much now, but we spent a lot of time in here looking at the biomechanics of it, breaking it down into different phases, all of those sorts of things. Do you think that's a good use of your time if you're trying to improve a skill? I'll leave that question open, okay? Bearing in mind, the way that you get better at a skill, a large part's through physical practice. So, you could start talking about that, all right? And then finally, what are other factors that could influence your ability to improve? I won't talk too much about those. We'll get to those when we get to that, or maybe in a week or two, okay? All right? So that's how you're going to attack it, all right? You've got all the resources there for when I'm not here next week. But I would expect by the beginning of next week, we're up to this phase here, okay? Any patai? Or more patai? Cool, thanks. Okay, so